Hey, this is John Lee Dumas, the founder and host of Entrepreneurs on Fire. And if you're wanting to learn how to embrace change and navigate through disruption as a leader, then listen to the Leadership is Changing podcast with my good friend, Denis Gianoutsos. He's prepared to ignite.
Welcome to Leadership is Changing. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change. This is taking your leadership to another level by finding the balance between executive excellence and personal well-being through stories that inspire real change. It's time to adapt in our fast-moving world when leadership is changing with your host, Denis Gianoutsos.
Who's your favorite leader and why?
I'll start backwards. If you interview any CEO on this planet, if you ask them, what is your two most favorite books you read? First one's going to be Art of War of Sun Tzu. And most of people, they believe they read that book, but that book, it's very complex because it requires a lot of strategic thinking. And second one, it's Niccolo Machiavelli, The Prince. Now, the both books are the great examples of the leadership. Sun Tzu, he was the leader in true sense, and he's my favorite leader because he was delivering messages how to conduct a war at a less expense to his king and his kingdom with minimum losses, and yet to deliver all these tactics and technologies and modus operandi how to conduct a war. Because we must be clear, 2000 years ago, nobody was working in Amazon, in the logistics. Everything was like being conquered the land and what you had. Second one is Niccolo Machiavelli. So Sun Tzu is my number one true example of the leadership. Niccolo Machiavelli is the second, not as a leadership, but as somebody who was the whisperer to the leaders. Even his book, The Prince, has been questioned in history that that book that has been written actually as a pure, divine alter ego to come with a good grace of the king. He was serving Boja, and he influenced the generation how to behave. That's Sun Tzu for me, yes.
Now, have you met, I don't think you have met the author, right?
Look, we try to arrange some coffee in afterlife. This moment, we will see.
So I've got a question here. So if you were both sitting on a park bench somewhere and you
Yes.
could have a coffee with that person,
Yes.
what would be the question you would ask them?
Do you believe that your book influenced generations and generations? That would be my one. That was my, because people when leave the legacy and those times people wrote these things. There's a favorite swordsman, Yamato Musashi from Japan, 16th century. He has 67 jewels, and he was having micro leadership, and he wrote something that was called a doko, where you're living for the leaders. This is the type of people who wrote these things to learn to teach generations after them. But that being said, there has never been known to them that somebody applied this. And you agree, Dennis, with me. You're running the great podcast, Dennis. I really enjoy being today with you. But as well, you have the competitors of your own, and I have of mine. And they will do everything now for your work to be seen different way. So imagine one script writing from Sun Tzu could be burned, right? And nobody will know. So that's why I'm sure that he knows that he's been applied. Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting how a lot of us as leaders today, what we say and what we do, whether it be in the way of the words we use, the actions we take, a book you read, an interview on a podcast, actually running your own podcast, doing or speaking on stage, you will impact people for generations to come. But
Yes.
we just don't actually always know that. I don't know about you, Mario, but I'm always surprised when somebody comes to me 2 or 3 years later or 5 years later and goes, you said this on this date. And I go, oh, what did I say? And it was like, you said this and this, but this has actually changed my life for good. And it's been really awesome. And it just brings a tear to my eyes because I go, whoa, look at the power that we actually have. And I'm not saying to be powerful and be
Yes.
strong people. I'm not talking about that at all. It's just, it's amazing what we can do today to impact generations of the future.
And that's what you're doing, Dennis. And for that, I'm grateful. Talk about leadership, it's very ungrateful. There's so many definitions, but the true example of leadership it is, as you and I spoke, last 2 years, I saw how the COVID amplified people behavior on a good or bad way.
Yep.
Leadership It's different when you're sitting behind the desk and you've been protected by the many obstacles for the normal people, army, police, and everything else. If you're politicians sometimes, that's not the leadership. Being in politics, that's not the leadership. Just even job. There's no qualifications for this. And because after all, leader does decision making for everybody in corporation. What you did, you decided clearly, consciously, deliberately, and purposely. I will not sit and just wait till COVID goes. I will utilize my time. And for that, that's a display of the leadership. Even you don't need to have 500 people behind you, Dennis, but your actions helps others. And that's us is this.
Yeah, I did a photo shoot. Mario, don't laugh too much at me when I'm about to tell you this.
So
now.
what? I was laughing because you say it. Okay.
I did a photo shoot about 4 years ago, and
Yes.
about an hour and a half. It was 2 hours long, and I was
Mhm.
just playing. I had to be animated to help the photo.
Yes.
And the guy goes to me, "You've got a great face for radio." And I'm like, "Not a great face for a TV, but a great face for radio? What are you talking about, man?"
I heard that once somebody told me there's a great face for radio, right? And I'm like, nobody sees you behind the mic.
Oh.
But people don't remember the images. We all been driven by the sound and smell. What I learned in Intelligence Academy, one of the classes with that lady, she told us everything is in binary codes. We live in binary codes, so everything is in numbers. But one thing what we can't ignore is sound and smell.
Mhm.
Smell opens for any leader. It's going to remind them on,
Absolutely does. I was 5 years of age, and I went to Greece for 6 months with my mum and dad on holiday. And for 16 years, there was this smell, and I could never remember where that smell was. And when I was 21 years of age and I landed back in Athens, got picked up, taken to my auntie's apartment building. It was winter. Soon as the apartment door opened, that smell, which is the
Through the
thing
heat,
that
yeah.
goes through the heating of the place. As soon as I hit it, I was like, whoa. And I just remembered it. And it's amazing what people remember and what the brain processes as we go through things over life.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
Now, Mario, the show here is called Leadership is Changing. When I mentioned that title or that statement, what does that mean to you?
Leadership, what it means. Sorry, the question was leadership means to me or?
Leadership is changing. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, no doubt that, as I mentioned in our previous conversation a few minutes ago, that COVID changed the landscape of the behavior and the thinking. And the leaders, I truly believe, we all saw actually so many corporations, they try to see beyond horizon and relied heavily on overseas operations. I always come back to the one point, leaders, if he doesn't understand his local area, you can't understand what's happening in other city. So what I'm going to see, or what I would like to see, it's a new generation of the leaders, because all generations of the leaders is gone. The way of thinking, way of acting, way of decision making, it's gone. Information changing the landscape of decision making. It's a lot of misinformation, disinformation. And it's going to ask this changing of the leadership is going to ask and seek for the people or the leaders from the management, right? What I try to say, somebody who understands inside, outside operations, somebody who is dedicated to the company and who's going to understand informations changing. It's inevitable. And we had leaders, we need to understand, and my understanding is that's how I was educated. There's a two type of leaders. You have the war leaders, and you have the leaders in the peace. Great example is Winston Churchill. He was a great world leader. He was a great war leader. Did he win election after war? No, nobody wanted him anymore. Yeah, there's several reasons why not, but nobody wanted him because he saw. Same comes in the COVID. COVID absorbed, I think it's like a sponge, right, between everything. Absorbed all leaders, sucked them inside, and needs to now produce the new generations of leaders. And the new generation of the leaders is not what I was being introduced with. It's a new generation, this people who can they're decisive, they're cunning, and they are very knowledgeable about local market rather than just seeing beyond horizon and overseas, which means less strategic thinking was going to happen in 5 years' time overseas, rather concentrate yourself on a market you can control. And I saw this during the lockdown and the COVID. People are being lost because they have operations overseas. And they don't understand what's happening. There's no goods, there's no employees, people working from home. So new generation of employees is going to be something like a Dennis, people who work tirelessly through COVID. That's why these people who never stopped working through COVID and who didn't expose themselves to the public and brought negative attention to the company.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think those leaders who have kept going throughout that whole period of time, you're right, are the ones that are going to still rise up. Really interesting, those who did rise up and those who didn't. Those who had the
Yes.
title, they didn't stand up, and you're like, what? And then others who didn't have the title did stand up. So that's our leaders. We had a survey done here in New Zealand recently, and I
Yes.
don't know the actual stats. I'm not going to say it, but I just know that they asked about politics or politicians and also the media have lost trust from people. But the ones that
Right.
people do trust are business leaders
Yes.
or businesses, and they are trusting them more than anyone at the moment. So it was interesting to see where that's going to go in alignment to what you've just shared as well. So I think
Yes.
it's really interesting. Who's your favorite leader and why?
Oh, do I have to choose one?
How many you got?
I was recently asked this question in another way. I was asked, who would I like to spend dinner with? And I'm going to answer the same way that I answered that question, which is Stacey Abrams. She's running for governor of the state of Georgia here. She ran for governor a few years ago, and she took that loss, and I paused to say loss because there were a lot of discrepancies in the voting process there in the state. And so there were questions and a cloud about the legitimacy of the outcome of the governor's race. But she took that opportunity and leveraged it to say, what do we need to do within the state to really build momentum and change things? And so she worked with grassroots leaders and organizations that had already been doing the work, but really galvanizing, right? Voter registration and significantly increasing the number of Black, Latino, Latinx, as well as Asian Americans in the state to vote. That ultimately all garnered this energy and momentum that for the first time in a very long time, the state of Georgia that has historically voted Republican into office for the first time turned what we say here blue, right? Which made a big difference in the presidential election. But as I've watched Stacey Abrams, I had the opportunity to see her speak live, and I was just so floored by her presence and leadership and able to communicate with the audience. And she was going around the room and taking 3, 4, 5, 6 questions at once. And then when she came to answer each one, she knew exactly where the first questioner was, where the second questioner was, the third questioner was, and directed her responses in such a very personalized way, which I think is really important quality for leadership, is that even though you're speaking to a broad audience, right, the ability to make people feel seen and heard and touch individuals while you're also touching a wide swath of people is a very powerful skill to have and to build as a leader. The other thing about Stacey Abrams that I find totally fascinating is she writes romance novels. So we have this powerful, dynamic Black woman political leader that for many years was writing romance novels under a pseudonym, under a different name.
Oh, wow.
And now that she's reached this level of recognition, she's republished these novels under her name. But I just love the versatility. That's also reflective of all of us, right? We have so many different sides. And I love leaders that are able to truly be authentic and show the different sides of them. So I love that we have this powerful woman, former state representative and candidate for governor that also doesn't mind showing she's got this wild and creative side to her as well.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think that's really important. It's awesome to see that somebody has another outlet or another way of actually expressing her creative side of things, which is the writing, right, which is really good. What you said as well about the skill set that she has to be able to listen to what's going on in the audience, take on those questions, then start to answer them and look at the people that's actually asked. That's an awesome skill set to have. Now, since you've taken it down the track of actually the dinner, then because I actually have a follow-up question you see to my question, which was, if you were sitting on a park bench having a coffee with Stacey, what would you ask? But since you're If you're at dinner one-on-one with Stacey, what would be one question you would like to ask her?
How do you keep up your energy to respond to the level of demand and requests for her leadership and guidance? Because I think that's also really important too, is how not only how do you keep up your energy, how do you sustain yourself ultimately is for me what I think is important. I just started meditation practice. And one of the quotes that was offered at the end of one of the meditations this week was the importance of nurturing the roots of life. Right. And a lot of that is also those moments of quiet, of where we're able to be still, but also the time with family, the time for self care being so important for us to be able to build our reserves so that we are able to show up as full leaders and in the full capacity that many are looking for us to be able to show up fully and authentically.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. We do need to take time out to meditate for sure, to think, but also just have that quiet time. And listeners, I'm going to actually encourage you, if you don't do this today, to actually put some time into your calendar just to have me time or quiet time. And it could be just 15 minutes, could be right through for an hour if you want, but it's a lot of quiet time. But also it's time to think, but also it's just time to be quiet. Turn the devices off, just get away from things, be quiet, because it'd be really interesting to see what comes up for you, which is going to be really quite cool to know. Now, the title of the show is called Leadership is Changing. And no, Judy, you can't change this title. It is the title of the show. When I say that title or that statement, what does that mean for you?
So I have to think about it in the context and the work that we do every day. We work largely with, as I mentioned, organizations and leaders that are taking the charge of equity to heart, right? And particularly in the last few years when we saw the racial justice uprisings in 2020 as a result of the police killings here in the US, many organizations and companies made pledges to be anti-racist, to really internalize what it means to be an equitable organization, to change their policies, their practices, to hire more people of color, and to make sure that there were equitable opportunities for advancement. And so that was a clear opportunity for leadership to change.
Mm.
And leadership is changing in response to those demands. Leadership has to change to be more equitable, to be more inclusive. And so, in the work that we have done, particularly over the past 4 to 5 years, working with leaderships and orgs to build racial equity, is that what we were finding is that leadership was not ready to change. And that was impeding progress, and it was impeding staff of color in particular, but even younger staff, junior staff, from really believing that leadership was committed to changing and to building an organization that was truly inclusive and equitable, and where there was more power sharing, for example, across the organization. And so one of the things that we learned very early on when we started working with our client partners was that leadership had to be in the room,
Mm.
because we had a couple of engagements where we didn't have the full leadership in the room. We maybe had one person from the leadership team or two people from the leadership team. And so we would go through this process of building a working group or task force within the organization or government agency. We train them, we conduct an organizational assessment, and everyone on the working group understood what was going on. They were part of that process. And then when we had to go back to leadership and say, look, this is what your employees said in the survey and in the focus groups, we got a lot of pushback from leadership that didn't want to believe what people were saying that they had experienced within the organization. And then they weren't necessarily wanting to adopt the changes that we were suggesting or their internal working group was suggesting. And so we had two experiences like that. And we said, you know what? We're not going to work with any organizations where the CEO or the main person, the executive director, is not going to be on that working group. And that we would have to have a number of other people from the leadership team part of that change process. And that has made all the difference
Mm.
in how we progress through these racial equity change processes over the past few years, is that leadership has to be a part of the change, and members of leadership have to change themselves. And so we work through a lot of those questions and challenges in trainings and workshops with organizational leaders because employees and staff more broadly are looking to leadership to embody what it means for their workplace, for their institution to really be committed to equity, inclusion and justice and belonging. And so if leadership is not in the room and leadership is not part of the change process, not just talking about it, but really being present and verbalizing and vocalizing why it is important for themselves personally, as well as for the organization that they are trying to change, then that all that work really gets thrown out the window. And so we didn't want to, if you're going to go through a 9-month, 12-month engagement with Cure, right? We wanted to make sure that was going to be a process that was going to result in substantive change.
I'm glad you actually shared that with us because I was about to ask you, there's a lot of leaders that got up and said at the time of Black Lives Matter and so forth, that they got up, well, this is what we're going to do and we should do that. And I'm thinking, you're saying that, but how many of you are actually doing it? And I think you've just answered the question there for me already. So it's not about some doing it, but it's also making sure you've got the right players in the room who are buying into it and also bringing it to life within the organization. Now, whether that be the CEO or another senior leader or the exec in the team who's the sponsor that represents that executive team to say, we've got to do this and this is what we are doing to get the buy-in. It absolutely does. I've got a background whereby my father is from Greece and coming from a Greek background, he came to New Zealand 62 years ago. And even as an immigrant coming to New Zealand, it was really quite interesting in what he went through and so forth. But there's a Greek saying out there that says, the fish rots from the head. And I think if you just talk about the actual example, what you've actually just shared there with us, that if it's not being owned by the leaders within the organization, the senior leaders, and they actually really do own it and they actually bring it to life and they are actually talking about it and so forth, then it ain't going to happen. It'll happen in little pockets, but it's not going to actually happen. Mm-hmm. And it's not just around what you've just shared, it's around anything that we do in business as well, yeah, which is really interesting.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leadership is Changing with your host, Denis Gianoutsos. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change, inspiring executives and leaders to adapt and lead a bigger game in a fast-moving world.